I never thought a heart could tell a story that no one wanted to hear. It was just another autopsy for me, a case that seemed simple. A man with no medical history, found dead on a street in Bogota. But when I opened the chest, something made me stop. His heart didn't fit with the rest of the body. Something was out of place, as if it belonged to someone else. How was that possible? A mistake in identification? I had to find out what was going on. Before I start, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it reached. The body arrived at the Forensic Institute on an ordinary morning. A man about 40 years old, without documents or family to claim him. At first, he was just a number, another file, but when I opened the thorax, everything changed. His heart had a shape and size that didn't correspond to his slender physique. The blood, the muscle, the arteries, everything seemed normal, but anatomically, that organ simply wasn't in place. In my profession, you learn to distrust the first diagnosis. This wasn't any common failure. It couldn't be a simple malformation or a packaging error. So I began reviewing the medical history, looking for clues. But there was nothing that explained that strange heart. But what if it wasn't his heart? What if it belonged to someone else? The idea seemed absurd at first, but I had to explore it. I thought I had confused the body. Maybe a swap, a terrible one, happened before or after death. I contacted the police to see if there was a case of switch bodies. Nothing. The genetic tests arrived soon, and that's when everything got even more mysterious. The DNA from the heart didn't match the DNA from the rest of the body. In other words, the heart belonged to another man, someone unknown to the police and to me. Imagine the shock. I was facing a body with two internal identities. What story was that man hiding? And why had someone tried to hide or alter it? The investigation grew deeper. I contacted experts in forensic medicine, pathologists, and geneticists. We wanted to understand how and why a heart could not belong to the person it accompanied. Between analyses and interviews, a name appeared, a brother lost for decades. The data indicated that our patient had a twin brother, separated at birth, something hidden by the family to avoid a scandal. Suddenly, everything fit. That heart, though different, was a living remnant of a broken family story, of secrets and silences no one wanted to face. The body, in its final state, spoke to me about betrayal, abandonment, and connections that go beyond genetics. This case not only taught me never to judge what I see at first glance, but also that the body, even after death, is an open book where the deepest truths are written. Never before had a body told me so much. And you, what would you have done if you were a forensic pathologist facing a heart that simply didn't match? I only want the content of the text translated, without any explanation or indication at that moment, while holding that strange heart in my hands. A mixture of perplexity and curiosity took over me. It was not common to find such marked differences during an autopsy, differences that were not limited to a defect or malformation, but seemed to tell a hidden story. Its size, the texture of the tissue, even the arrangement of its cardiac chambers did not match anything I had studied before. It was as if that heart had lived another life, belonged to someone else, yet was housed in this man's chest. The first thing I thought was a possible anastomosis, an uncommon heart surgery, or a transplant done long ago, perhaps clandestinely. But no, there were no scars, no signs of surgical intervention, and his body showed no evidence of having undergone a transplant. Then the idea of a rare congenital pathology crossed my mind, a condition the patient may have carried without being diagnosed. But even so, the shape and structure did not match any scientific descriptions I knew. Taking a bit more distance before closing the report, I collected samples of the cardiac tissue for deeper histopathological analysis. I wanted to understand if that heart had developed any unusual cellular changes, something that would give me clues. While waiting for the results, I sent images to colleagues specializing in forensic cardiology, seeking opinions, trying to find any reference that fit what I had before me. My messages reached experts in different parts of the country, and I stayed alert for any response, one that could offer a possible explanation. But the sharp needle of doubt deepened when, surprisingly, I received an anonymous phone call. The voice, hoarse and measured, said only a few words before hanging up. "Look in the civil registry. There lies a story that Hart is hiding from you. My rational side insisted that it could all be a bad joke, but part of me, the most intuitive, knew I had to heed that sign. That call was the first indication that what I had in my hands was much more than a medical case. It was a door that would lead me to a painful past or perhaps a buried secret. The next day, I went with the deceased documentation to the Civil Registry Office in downtown Bogota. Finding basic information for a man without record seemed a simple task. But as I dug deeper into his family history, I noticed how it began to intertwine with names and dates that didn't match. There was no record of his birth as it appeared in his documents, and his death certificate was signed under a completely different identity. As a forensic specialist, I am used to working with precise data, but here, precision dissolved like sand through my fingers. While reviewing the yellowed papers, a photograph began to fall from a poorly closed file. It was a black and white image where a family in close-up held a man with a face and demeanor I immediately recognized. It was the same body I had faced in the morgue, but surrounded by different people. Behind him stood another man who seemed serious, with that protective and stern air of father or older brother. It was an ordinary picture, but what caught my attention most was a small medallion he wore, which matched the tattoo I'd seen on the deceased's forearm. Everything started to fit, but not in the way I expected. That led me to search the family archive in the commune where, according to his initial documents, he had lived. There, in the worn words of old neighbors and their fragmented stories, appeared the piece that shook me to the core. That man, for whom I had started the autopsy, was not who he claimed to be, nor was his story what it seemed. Even the structure of that out-of-place Hart made sense if I allowed myself to consider the hypothesis of a crossed identity. The voices told me that years ago, that man had been switched at a hospital with another baby during a rainy night in a makeshift hospital on the outskirts of Bogota, marked by scarcity and chaos. What might seem like a story from a novel to many came to life for me with every page I read, with every new piece of evidence gathered over hours, and all, ironically, manifested in that organ that did not fit beyond genetics. My gaze returned once more to the anatomical report. The heart that did not match spoke not only of physical difference, but an irrefutable biological truth. It revealed that for decades, the subject had lived a life that was not his own, with a lineage foreign to his veins, while, anonymously, another person had taken the place that belonged to him. What implications would this discovery have? Who were these men really? As I delved into their stories, I found tales of broken families, separated brothers, parents who searched relentlessly for their lost children. But the most disturbing revelation was that the reason for the silence was not always human error, but sometimes dark family secrets, in which the truth was too painful to come to light. I visualized a hospital bed more than 4 decades ago, amid the muted noise of machines, the anguish and exhaustion of nurses and doctors. There, unknowingly, 2 lives had crossed forever, and although that exchange was involuntary, its impact resonated through time, shaping opposite destinies and leaving aside the most immediate questions. What does it truly mean to be family? Is it blood that defines us, or the identity built in life? Images of the open body, the cold skin to the touch, the silent precision of forensic context returned to me. In the midst of a mechanical, almost automatic task, I had stumbled upon a mystery so human and complex that no forensic science could fully explain it. That strange, unconnected heart was the perfect metaphor for a fragmented past. At that point, I knew I had to communicate these findings as delicately as possible. I contacted the family members, those who responded, at least, and told them what was evidently painful and unsettling. There were faces marked by disbelief, sadness, and for some, hope to piece together a puzzle that had left invisible scars for years. Some accepted to talk. Others shut down in silence. The legal and emotional implications surrounding this discovery were profound, but I, as a doctor and storyteller, could only offer them the truth, the one the body had kept so carefully. As I write these lines, I constantly think about how that case, which began as a simple autopsy, taught me that our body is not just a container of organs, but a living archive, a silent witness that at any moment can break its silence and tell stories that the human voice does not understand or prefers to forget. In the Bogota morgue, I learned that some hearts do not only differ anatomically, but in the very essence of identity. And in discovering this, We faced the deepest and most disturbing aspects of what it means to be human. The days following that discovery were a roller coaster of emotions and revelations that seemed determined to leave me breathless. Every new detail, every small piece of information I deciphered, pulled me deeper into a web of secrets woven over decades. I kept returning to the lab, repeatedly reviewing the reports, analyzing every line, every mark, as if desperately trying to find an error that would allow me to return to the routine I longed for so much. But there was no mistake. Everything fit together so meticulously that it was impossible to deny. The family I thought I knew, with their supposed names and certain dates, was in reality a fragmented story, riddled with silences and hidden crumbs. On one of my visits to the old commune, I was able to speak with an elderly woman who clearly remembered that rainy and confusing night at the hospital where, according to her memories, 2 newborns had been mistakenly given to the wrong parents. Her words, trembling and slow, carried the weight of eternal remorse, a pain that had not gone away despite the years. The idea that the baby I raised was not mine never left me, but I could do nothing. No one listened to me. What she told me not only reinforced the hypothesis of the switch, but also opened a crack in the official version. Apparently, the makeshift hospital, known for its lack of resources and control, had been the scene of more life mix-ups that explained the chaos, but not the calculated silence that followed. According to the woman, the doctors and administrators preferred to bury that dark night to avoid scandals, something not unusual in that social and political context. It was terrifying to think about how negligence and fear could override ethics and truth, acting as a shadow that remains alive even today. In those days, I also witnessed a reaction of the relatives when confronted with this new reality. When I spoke with the mother who had raised a man whose body lay on my table, her face went blank in an instant. She could not believe what I was telling her, not out of disbelief, but because understanding it meant an avalanche of pain, unacknowledged betrayals, and difficult decisions. For them, it was easier to cling to the life they had built. That identity, though mistaken, was the only tangible truth. However, the story kept digging and stirring to the deepest core. As I reviewed the tattoos and marks on the deceased body, another enigma caught my attention. On the inside of the forearm, beneath the skin, the tattoo that seemed to match the medallion I saw in the photograph was an ancient symbol linked to an unofficial society, a small group that watched over the truth amid the city's opacity. This seemed more like something from a novel than a forensic report, but it existed. I began to investigate rigorously, bothering people who would have preferred not to talk. What I discovered confirmed that this man, although apparently unknown to many in terms of identity, had been involved in far larger and more complex matters. He had kept secrets, deliberately or for protection, connected to powerful entities and legal uncertainties. I confess I felt fear. Fear not only for what I found, but because I realized that unearthing that story could open wounds no one was ready to heal. Despite everything, my duties as a forensic specialist did not cease. I knew that behind every detail there had to be a scientific, human explanation, capable of helping to close or open new chapters. I decided to request genetic tests that would confirm the existence of that switch that seemed clearer as I progressed. I was not just interested in the body's identity, but in the definitive impact of that strange heart that did not fit within that man. That was when the lab results arrived. Genetics confirmed the unthinkable. The blood markers and DNA profile differed from the official family records. In other words, that man was not the biological son of the family with which he had lived, nor did his blood correspond to the documents he carried when he died. It was irrefutable proof that the baby's switch had happened. There was no room for denial. With this evidence in hand, a new task began for me. I not only had to record and document the case, but present coherent and necessary narrative for those who remain in the dark. For those who, though hurt, deserved to know the truth that their bodies and science had guarded until then. Searching for the other person involved was a labyrinth of lost files, calls to hospitals, contacts refusing to answer, and families reluctant to face a past they felt might destroy them. But the truth is that the past is never destroyed. It only waits for the exact moment to come to light. One afternoon, after weeks of investigation and visits to official offices, I received a message with an address. It was a working-class neighborhood, without luxuries, but with streets full of life and faces that could tell thousands of stories. I went there with both hope and fear because beyond the autopsy and tests, I knew that meeting could forever change the lives of those involved in that human error. I found an older man with a suspicious gaze, wearing the worn look of someone who had waited in vain for answers for a long time. When I told him about the switch, his eyes filled with tears, not only because of the revelation, but for the lost decades, the unexplained absence, the family he never had. Looking at him, I felt a deep mixture of sadness and humanity. It was not just a forensic case. It was a direct confrontation with the fragility and complexity of human identity. After that meeting, I understood that heart, which at first seemed a medical mystery to me, was actually the epicenter of a much larger and more sensitive story. A story of crossed lives, hidden decisions, and silent suffering that no documentation could cover. But it was also, incredibly, a symbol of hope, the possibility of reconstructing families, of seeking the truth even when it hurts, and of understanding that sometimes a body speaks clearer than any word. Returning to the morgue, that cold and silent place where it all began, I stopped to think about how every case we handle teaches us something not only about medicine or science, but about the human condition. In this case, the heart did not match, and not only because it was anatomically different, but because it represented a hidden fragment of history, of error and truth. Perhaps the most unsettling thing is understanding that within each of us there are stories the body tells without our knowing how to listen, tales that, though silent, resonate with the power to change everything. And as a forensic specialist, as someone used to facing death head-on, I learned that sometimes the greatest discovery is not in threatening certainty, but in accepting that science sometimes only raises more questions about who we really are. In that sense, that heart that did not fit was more than an anatomical finding or a point in a technical report. It was the beginning of a journey to find answers where no one dared to look, and to understand that the truth, painful as it may be, always has its heartbeat. The story, then, remains open, with questions that may never have full answers, but with the unquestionable certainty that identity is, in the end, a fabric so complex that it cannot and should not be left to chance or silence. And deep down, that makes me think that there are lives that, though incomplete or misdirected, have the power to teach us that what is essential is not just blood or matching documents, but the courage to seek the truth, even when it hurts, even when it unsettles, and even when a simple heart reveals to us the deepest secrets of the human soul. What came afterward was a whirlwind of sensations that I didn't quite know how to handle. Every conversation, every document, every suspicious look I received seemed to push me even further toward an emotional precipice. And there I was, in the middle of that crossroads, aware that what I was investigating was not just a medical case, but a deep and cruel wound, open for years, with sharp edges and unwilling to heal quietly. I remember that particular night, when sitting in front of the screen, I was reviewing the names and birth dates of the two men in question. The magnitude of the exchange had not only changed the course of their lives, but had also sown a deep mistrust in the social fabric surrounding them. I tried to imagine how many lives, silently, might have been similarly disrupted, trapped in invisible webs of errors, omissions, and half-truths. It was then that I understood this went beyond a simple forensic case. I was facing a living metaphor of our fragile construct of identity. For days, I tried to immerse myself in the personal stories intertwined in that hospital, the place so many came to seek hope and found uncertainty. Interviews with retired nurses, former administrative staff, and neighborhood residents revealed a bleak picture. Many suffered under the weight of unspoken secrets, under the pressure of imposed silence, as if admitting that failure would put something bigger at risk. There was fear, not just of what others might say, but of the real impact that uncovering the truth might have on already fragile communities, where stigma and poverty made it even harder to bear an uncomfortable truth. I tried to understand the motivations behind that institutional silence, and soon realized that fear spread in all directions. Fear of legal responsibility, fear of losing jobs, fear of the disintegration of families already on the edge of the abyss. And amid that tangle, the truly affected, the exchanged individuals, were just pieces on a much larger board, whose game was called protection, but actually concealed negligence and a palpable disregard for human and medical truth. The truth that had emerged in the heart of the corpse I had examined, with its discordant anatomy, now appeared as a symbol a silent epitaph of what had happened. During those weeks, an unexpected encounter also took place. A young man, someone who apparently had followed the case with interest after some journalistic notes published in a local outlet, decided to approach me. With a firm voice marked by a mixture of anger and sadness, he confided that he suspected he himself might have been a victim of that error years earlier, or perhaps had been related to one of the two exchange babies. His personal story, a combination of emotional voids and a tireless search for belonging, intertwined with the logic of the case. That conversation brought with it a new complexity. It was not a closed mystery, nor a resolved chapter. It was a web that remained alive, shaping identities, relationships, and expectations. Instinctively, I understood the ethical responsibility on my shoulders. To speak, to reveal, to protect. All were actions with their place, but finding that balance was a constant challenge. Science and biology were not enough. I needed humanity to navigate that storm of emotions, fears, and resentments. That was why, when communicating results, I tried to be delicate, aware that those words could forever change the lives of those who listened. However, there was a twist I did not expect. In a random review of forgotten documents in hospital archives, I found an incomplete medical report with erasures and handwritten notes. That paper mentioned the existence of a third child involved in similar circumstances, someone who had been registered erroneously years before and whose identity seemed lost in time. It was possible that this case was also related to the exchange I had discovered. That possibility opened a new door, a door through which the hospital's secrets wanted to remain closed, but which now stood open before me. This revelation forced me to expand my investigation, to return to those working-class neighborhoods, to speak with more families, to examine more records, a tiring, emotionally draining task, but one that felt urgent and necessary. Each interview brought to light stories of abandonment, of fractured but resilient families, stories that rarely found an echo outside those invisible walls of daily pain. And in that back and forth, I discovered that the technical truth had given way to a much more human and complex truth. Identities, no matter how fixed and defined we believe them to be, were fragile constructions that could collapse with a single datum, a single piece of evidence, a single heartbeat that did not match. Tensions grew as political and social interests began to emerge. There was a risk that the case would become a public slaughter, a spiral of finger-pointing that ended up destroying lives without reparation. Some involved parties began to pressure to limit access to information. Hospitals and local authorities were reluctant to cooperate, perhaps trying to protect a reputation that had been severely damaged. In this environment, my role ceased to be merely that of a scientific observer and transformed into that of a guardian of an uncomfortable but necessary truth. Aware of the responsibility this implied, I decided to document every finding with the utmost rigor, seeking to protect the people involved without failing to expose reality. It was meticulous, persistent, almost obsessive work. The heart that began as a simple anatomical enigma had become a beacon illuminating not only the shadows of negligence, but the very shadows of human and family identity. And it was that heart that, in silence, taught me something invaluable, that the truth, however painful, always finds a way to come out, and that sometimes it is necessary to face fear and uncertainty to begin to heal. The hours in the morgue once again became strange and heavy. Every time I observed that organ that didn't correspond, I felt the presence of all those intertwined stories, of those silences that scream, of those bodies still demanding justice. In that cold place, death became alive in its most complex and human manifestation. And I, as a temporary guardian of their story, knew that the story that had begun with a difference of heart was much more than medicine or science. It was the story of the human condition confronting its own contradictions and seeking meaning in what seems absurd at first glance. I can't hide that those weeks changed me as well. As a forensic specialist, I had always learned to separate emotion from professionalism, to look without getting involved. But this case showed me that behind every body there is a life, with its pains, desires, and secrets. I realized that the work we do not only closes stories, but opens them, confronts them with the harshest reality, and ultimately can also be a bridge toward truth and reconciliation. Science gave me the evidence, biology a precise narrative, but it was humanity that extended its arm to hold the truth. And in that balance I found, perhaps, one of the most valuable lessons of my career. This heart that didn't match was not only beating the body I studied, but in every person touched by this story. A heartbeat renewing the hope that discovering the truth, no matter how disturbing, is always a first step toward rebuilding what has been broken. I know this saga has no clear or comfortable ending. The full truth will probably remain elusive to many, and the pain may never fully disappear. But if there is something I can say for sure, it is that none of this was in vain. The silence has been broken, and although sometimes it may seem easier to keep pretending, the truth, like the tireless heartbeat of a heart that refuses to close, always finds its way out to the light, to remind us who we are and to teach us that what is essential is not only in the blood, but in the courage to face head-on what at first sight seems impossible. Amid that whirlwind of conflicting emotions, I decided to follow the trail of that incomplete report, the key that could unlock the last padlock of this tangled web. I returned to the hospital when the corridors were already deserted, with a faint yellow light barely illuminating the worn stains on the walls. I reviewed the files again, hoping to find more documents related to that third child mentioned briefly. Slowly, among yellowed papers and poorly filed folders, new clues emerged: an old, poorly filled birth record, a hospitalization certificate that did not match the official identity, and, most unsettling, a handwritten testimony hidden in the folder of a retired doctor, speaking an inevitable confusion, an unnamed error, a child who had possibly been adopted unknowingly or worse, sold. I was frozen, imagining the consequences of that revelation. It was not simply an isolated case or a minor accident. There was an entire network of negligence, perhaps hidden intentions or even silent complicities that had turned lives into interchangeable pieces. The face of the young man who had approached me weeks before appeared vividly in my mind. What if he was not the only one? How many other souls had been torn from their roots by a failed system? But above all, how to reconcile with an identity we always believed secure, only to discover it was an illusion woven with errors and omissions? I then decided to contact some lawyers and social counselors, people who could offer ethical and emotional guidance to those affected. The conversation with them was revealing and, at the same time, discouraging. They explained to me how Colombian law handles these complex cases, but also the rigidity of the system to admit errors when public or private institutions are involved. The pressure to maintain appearances was suffocating, and although no one could deny the human dimension of the story, political and economic interests overshadowed everything. That brought me back to reality. I was just a piece on this board, someone who had discovered a different heart, a symbol, but who had to proceed carefully so that symbol would not become a weapon that hurt more than it healed. The nights became even longer and heavier. More than once, while reviewing old photographs and medical records, I felt the story completely absorb me, the air becoming dense, weighed down by its gravity. It was not just a forensic case. It was a window into the purest human vulnerability, the fragility of what we understand as identity and belonging. Until then, I had lived on the sidelines of that pain, like a cold spectator. But now, with each new piece of data, with each difficult conversation, with each gesture of mistrust or fear, I had become part of that web, a witness forced to carry that disturbing truth. On one of those days when despair threatened to dominate me, I received an unexpected call. It was the mother of the man whose heart had given me the first clue, an older woman, with a trembling voice full of a mixture of sadness and restrained hope, invited me to her house. She wanted to talk, to tell her version, her memories behind the official shadows. I accepted, aware that those words could be revealing or perhaps only open more wounds. In that meeting, between tears and fragmented stories, I understood that for her, that revelation not only meant that her son was not biologically hers, but that her whole life, her sacrifices and dreams were questioned by an error committed long before she even had the chance to know the truth. Her stories pointed to a collapsed hospital system, a series of misencounters, bad practices, and even negligence that had been silenced under a cloak of bureaucracy. She also told me about enforced silence, veiled threats to keep things from coming to light, and the discomfort caused by speaking of this issue in her community. Despite that pain, her deepest desire was that others would not suffer the same confusion or the same wound in their soul. That conversation was a turning point in my work. It was not just science that had to speak, but the voices of those who live with the consequences, because without them, the truth remained incomplete and cold. Shortly after, I resumed interviews in the communities surrounding the hospital. I walked narrow streets, knocked on doors with silent respect, seeking those families who held broken pieces of a story that seemed not entirely their own, listening to parents who did not know whom they had hugged in childhood, to siblings facing the uncertainty of a blood tie in doubt, was both heartbreaking and revealing. In those talks, questions arose that science could not fully answer. What defines a family? Is it blood or the love and bonds built day by day? How to heal when identity seems to have been ripped away without warning? It was in one of those homes, among the humble walls of a popular neighborhood, where a woman told me something I will never forget. "Doctor, I don't know who I am, and maybe I never will. But I know who loves me, and that is the only thing I want to be clear about." That simple yet profound phrase hit me with unexpected force. It made me doubt for a moment everything I was pursuing. The truth, painful as it was, might not be the only path to healing. There was also a human truth more complex, that reconciled uncertainty with hope. Meanwhile, external pressure was growing. Some local journalists picked up the story with a sensationalist tone, and that began to complicate the atmosphere even more. I noticed that the affected families started to close off, fearing exposure to mockery or social rejection. In that tension, I realized my responsibility not only to the truth, but to the care and protection of those who experienced the consequences of those errors firsthand. It was a constant balance between tireless pursuit and deep respect for human dignity. In the following weeks, my team and I managed to partially reconstruct the hospital procedures of that era, comparing them with the legal and social frameworks in force. We discovered there had been alerts, fragmented complaints, but the system had silenced, postponed, or ignored them. That discovery not only confirmed the extent of the problem, but also the urgent need for profound changes. I could not help but feel outraged and frustrated before a system that allowed lives to be destroyed by a chain of irresponsibilities that no one seemed willing to assume. Amid all these revelations, one detail caught my attention strongly: the desperate searches by some individuals years ago attempting to find traces of their biological identity. Almost erased files, unanswered letters, testimonies crying out for someone to listen. Those stories revived the heartbeat of the mismatched heart, prolonging the question, who are we really? It was in that context that I began to feel this was no longer just a professional case. It was becoming a personal mission, a search for justice, but also for humanity. Again, something interrupted the relative calm I had managed to find. One day, an anonymous package arrived at my office. Inside, I found old photos, a handwritten letter, and documents suggesting the story might not have ended with that third child, that perhaps there was a fourth, or even more unexpected exchanges hidden for decades. That possibility added another layer of complexity, but also restored my certainty that the truth is like an underground river. No matter how much they try to block it, it always finds a crack to flow through. Holding those papers, I once again felt the weight of responsibility. How could I do justice to so many invisible voices? How to balance scientific rigor with human clarity? I understood that the road ahead would be long and painful, but also necessary, because in that mismatched heart there was not just a medical error. There was a story challenging concepts, questioning established truths, and above all, tasting of hope for those who dare to listen. With every step I took, with every discovery and every conversation, I felt I was entering a story bigger than any file or autopsy. It was the story of a city of communities, of entire families who, unknowingly, live with a dissonant heartbeat inside them. And that dissonance, uncomfortable and disturbing, was also the call to open our eyes, to rethink not only what we know about ourselves, but the way society protects, hides, and sometimes harms those who have the least. Now, more than ever, I understood that medicine, science, and justice cannot be separated from empathy and courage. It is not enough to uncover the truth if we are not willing to accompany those who must face it. That mismatched heart had shown me that behind every organ, behind every poorly filed file, there's a person who deserves to be seen, heard, and, as far as possible, healed. And although the story was far from over, that humanity, that would have faced the invisible, was the light that had guided me so far on this unpredictable path. I know there are still chapters to write, answers to find, and consequences to accept. But I also know that the first step, though disturbing, has already been taken. And sometimes the beat of a different heart is precisely what we need to break the silence, to understand the value of truth, and to finally begin to heal. Because in that heartbeat, which challenged everything we believe certain, there is a lesson beyond the medical case. The most authentic story of who we really are, built with facts, mistakes, and infinite desire to belong. That night, holding that anonymous envelope in my hands, I felt the mystery thicken, as if each document, each image, added a layer of fog to the truth I was trying to decipher. I looked at the photos in silence, faces that resembled each other, but whose destinies seemed to have been written with crooked and imprecise strokes. They had been captured at different times, in various hospitals and homes, and all held in their eyes a mixture of innocence and an invisible question waiting for answers. The letter was more cryptic, written by someone who seemed to regret not having been able to protect those souls from an unconfessed sin, a systematic mistake that had fractured lives in silence. That correspondence took me to a darker corner of history. I realized that behind those failures there was not only negligence and neglect, but a structure aimed at minimizing any damage at the cost of oblivion, perhaps out of fear of facing the truth, or perhaps due to a cruel calculation of interests. A silent wall had been built, a cold conspiracy of forgetting where the victims were not seen as people, but as mere administrative errors. The magnitude of that network overwhelmed me. It was as if the entire system had been machined that, under the appearance of care and order, had woven a web of deception difficult to dismantle. My days and nights merged into one uncertain time. I reviewed and compared every piece of data in the hospital, requested notices, cross-checked testimonies, and allowed myself few breaks, only the strictly necessary ones. Every new fragment that appeared seemed to open another abyss, another incomplete story screaming to be heard. Names began to emerge, documents that seemed to erase others, emails with evasive phrases, and medical appointments with contradictory data. Everything indicated that these were not isolated cases, but a recurring practice, a chain of small missteps with enormous consequences, protected by a silent pact of those who had the power to decide what remained hidden and what could be brought to light. Filtering the information was not easy. Some of my colleagues, upon learning isolated details, did not hesitate to warn me about the dangers of digging too deep. There are things that should not be brought to the surface. Julian. That truth could destroy more than it saves, they told me with mixture of concern and resignation. But that was precisely what drove me to continue. Deep down, I knew that stepping aside would only leave those families trapped in the shadows, voiceless, without memory. At that moment, I understood that my role would not only be that of forensic specialist who discovers the causes of a death, but the bridge between what had been silenced for so long and the possibility of truth, as difficult as it might be. Interviews with families became more frequent and profound. Some people were fearful, others deeply disillusioned, and some more willing to recount what they could no longer keep inside. However, in their words, there was something more than pain, an unstoppable need to know, to hold on to that elusive truth, to connect the pieces of their fragmented lives. Listening to their stories made me realize that identity is not only in documents or genome, but in shared experiences, in family narratives that are built and passed down. Yet, there is also a legitimate yearning to know, to understand one's roots, because in that discovery lies the possibility of reconstruction. It was during one of those interviews that something happened which changed the course of my investigation. An elderly woman, living in a modest neighborhood, handed me an envelope she had kept for years, not quite knowing why or for whom. Inside, I found letters exchanged between hospital officials, internal reports marked with warnings, and even a testimony signed by a doctor who had previously worked in neonatology. The document spoke frankly of an experimental program to accelerate processes, which ended in an ethical and human disaster. According to him, some children have been exchanged without follow-up, and more worryingly, any attempts to report this have been silenced to protect the institution. This evidence made it clear that I was facing something more than a bureaucratic error. It was a web where dehumanization had crossed all lines. Based on those documents, I presented the information to a select group of lawyers and human rights specialists. It was a tense meeting. Their faces showed consternation and the increasingly palpable dimension of the damage caused. They explained that legally there were mechanisms to address claims related to identity and restitution, but the pressure to cover up these facts was brutal. Powerful interests were involved, from hospital hierarchies to government officials, who saw the dissemination of this truth as a direct threat to their careers and institutional stability. They reminded me that facing this reality would mean confronting an entire machine that, despite being flawed, had managed to remain hidden for decades. The ethical processing of this information became a real challenge. How could I balance the family's right to privacy with the urgency of providing answers? How to protect those seeking the truth without exposing them to the social violence and stigma it would bring? There were moments when I thought about stopping, letting silence envelop everyone again, protecting them from a seemingly unbearable pain. But then I remembered the woman who told me, "I don't know who I am, but I know who loves me." It was that love, imperfect yet resilient, that kept me going. It was that humanity that had to prevail above all else. Weeks turned into months, and every step forward seemed to bring new challenges. Families sought answers, but also feared the consequences of those revelations. I often felt as if I were in the middle of a storm, trying to hold the truth without letting it become a hurricane that swept everything away. In that precarious balance, I understood the power of active listening, patient mediation, and deep respect. I realized that, for many, accepting the possibility of a different origin did not mean rejecting those who raised them, but an act of justice for those who gave them biological life and for themselves, who deserved to know the whole story. Among the documents I reviewed, one in particular captured me. It was an incomplete report from a psychologist who worked with various children and young people during that turbulent time. It described, with a mixture of scientific rigor and poetry, how many of those individuals lived with a dissonant heartbeat, as he called it, an internal, inexplicable sensation of not fully belonging, of searching for a place between two worlds. That explained the anguish, the constant searching, and sometimes a feeling of loss that many people experience without knowing the cause. Reflecting on this, I understood that beyond papers and proof, there was a deep, silent human aspect that required attention and compassion. An unexpected turn occurred when a young woman, who had followed the case through social media, approached me timidly during an open talk I gave at a community center. That day, she shared a fragment of her own story. She had discovered she was not the biological daughter of the family that raised her, a pain she had carried quietly for years. The surprising thing was that she had reconstructed part of her lineage thanks to a document that, curiously, appeared in the evidence I had received anonymously. Her courage to face that reality and her unwavering search inspired me. That young woman represented all those who, unwillingly, had become pieces of a broken puzzle, but who, through truth, could perhaps piece together their own lives. However, the social response was ambivalent. Despite clear intentions to seek justice and reparation, the news sparked divisions. Some media outlets exploited the story sensationally, exposing families to public shame and ridicule. The experience revealed to me the fragility of social justice when empathy is absent. It was then that I understood my work had to go far beyond laboratories and archives. It had to involve a committed effort to educate society about the complexity of identity, respect for human history, and the importance of accompanying those facing these invisible wounds. The fight for transparency and reparation began to take shape through dialogue tables with representatives of families, civil organizations, and authorities. The goal was not to find culprits, but to acknowledge mistakes and create a joint path toward reparation. I witnessed how truth generated both confrontation and healing. Mothers wept as they confessed their fears and broken dreams. Young people embraced upon finding answers, even painful ones. And amid it all, a feeling of hope began to take root, the longing that past mistakes could prevent future harm. Among those conversations emerged a question no one had clearly asked until then but floated in the air. What if there were more similar cases, invisible, buried in other institutions? That idea collided with the harsh reality of the social and health system in Colombia and many parts of the world, where care and protection are sometimes subordinated to bureaucracy and misinformation. The story I had begun to unravel was only the visible part of a larger systemic problem, and that realization made the heart that did not match beat strongly again, reminding me that justice does not end with single truth, but is an ongoing construction. One of the last pieces to appear in this network was an audio testimony sent by another anonymous source. A broken voice, identifying as a former hospital employee, detailed how, in a time marked by little control and much improvisation, atrocious decisions had been made for administrative convenience. That account quickened my pulse, not out of fear, but because of the tremendous emotional weight it carried. I understood that there was an unavoidable moral commitment to those words, which represented the voice of those who could not raise it in life. That recording was a turning point to unite the will of various parties to make visible a hidden truth that deserved to be recognized, heard, and repaired. With all that information in hand, I faced the titanic task of preparing a rigorous report that could serve not only the families, but also open a national debate on ethics, identity, and human rights. It was a process that mentally consumed me, stripped me of my own prejudices, and confronted me with the fragility of our existence. I discovered not only how much the system can fail, but also how much the human being can endure, adapt, and above all, love despite the wounds. That certainty became the drive that pushed me not to let this story end in a closed, forgotten file. However, as I progressed through those days of constant introspection and work, I was also aware that not everyone would be willing to accept that truth. I knew the story I was revealing would challenge constructed identities, shatter family certainties, and put more than one institutional ego on the line. Yet, I was also aware that the only way to truly heal is by facing the truth, no matter how painful it may be. Because lies and silence only perpetuate the suffering and uprooting that so many people felt without explanation. The heart that did not match, ultimately, taught me that there is no absolute or unchangeable identity, that we are a complex tapestry of circumstances, loves, certainties, and doubts, that sometimes a different piece does not break the whole, but adds depth. That dissonant heartbeat is also a call for empathy and justice, a beacon illuminating the shadows, so know as to live in the darkness of oblivion. The story, of course, did not end that day, nor will it end as long as there are those who seek answers, justice, and belonging. What I do know is that from that singular heart, imprinted on a body that seemed to tell a half-told story, something much bigger and more necessary began. Something that goes beyond medicine or law. The urgent need to recognize ourselves in our shared humanity, to accept our flaws as a community, and to build bridges that allow invisible wounds to heal. And it is there, in that commitment, where the true lesson lies. Because when the beat of a heart does not match, it is not just an anatomical or administrative error. It is the urgent need to listen to all voices, to give space to stories that society sometimes wants to silence. That is the truth that led me down this path, the one that still guides me with every step, and the one I hope can someday accompany those who dare to find their place amid uncertainty. Because, in the end, that search is also the very search for what it means to be human, complex, fragile, imperfect, but deeply valuable. What came next was no easier, but it was necessary. As I delved deeper into each file, into each testimony, I felt the gravity of what I was discovering, the vastness of the lives affected, and the silence that had covered everything for years. It was as if I had uncovered a huge wound that had been festering in the shadows, a broken fabric that described not only system failures, but the loss of fundamental truths for dozens, perhaps hundreds of people. But above all, it was the story of fragmented identities, of invisible bonds demanding to be recognized and understood. One of the longest nights was the one when, with a heavy heart, I reviewed again the original report describing the experimental program. As I read, incredulity gave way to a mixture of anger and deep sadness. Between official documents and handwritten notes, decisions made lightly were narrated, with a dark pragmatism that reduced the value of life to a mere statistical box. I realized then that it was not just negligence, but a kind of cruelty disguised as efficiency, as cold calculation, a system that took shortcuts in the name of rationality and paid an exorbitant price with the humanity of its victims. That same day, I received a call that almost made me fall out of my chair. It was a relative of one of the children affected, someone who after years had decided to break their silence. They spoke with a trembling voice, full of fear but with palpable strength, and asked me to bring their story to the public, not to allow those lives to be forgotten again. They told me stories of broken homes, of unconditional loves clashing with a destiny uprooted, of people who had grown up with the constant shadow of a truth denied to them. At that moment, I felt I was no longer alone in this fight, that despite the fear and imposed silence, hope was beginning to make its way. But not everything was a path forward. With every attempt to make these stories visible, I collided with walls of bureaucracy, institutional denial, and personal interest disguised as protocols. Some calls went unanswered. Other officials appeared evasive, almost offensive. On one occasion, during a meeting with hospital representatives, I felt a cold rejection when I raised the need for public recognition and serious reparation. The responses I received were evasive, with vague promises and a tone that made it clear they preferred not to stir up more skeletons. That resistance made me understand that the silence was voluntary, a deliberate construction to protect a system still incapable of reconciling its mistakes with the justice it owed. One of the most unexpected twists came when I looked at the history of a young man who had been the subject of one of those exchanges. All the official data marked one identity, but when I examined the heart, that organ that had started this odyssey, there was a noticeable difference, a beat that seemed to answer an unasked question. Medical and genetic tests took time to confirm it, but finally did. His biological ties did not match what his document said. However, that revelation raised more questions than answers. Who was he really? Where did he belong? How many people like him lived with that feeling of not fitting in, with that silent void? It was a deep blow, a shock that reminded me I was touching something more than paperwork. I was entering the very essence of being. For weeks I kept in touch with him and his adoptive family, who spoke with a mixture of pain and unconditional love. They confessed to me that this truth did not take away the affection they felt, but it did change their perception of what identity and roots meant for them. And for so many families, accepting these new facts implied a slow and delicate process of emotional reconstruction. That was when I understood that reality is not defined solely by blood, but by the bonds built day by day by commitment, and by the willingness to seek answers without losing tenderness and compassion. Each interview, each encounter transformed my vision. Beyond science and law, a human complexity appeared that no regulation could fully encompass. Ethics became a winding path, where absolute answers did not exist and where old wounds demanded more than justice. They demanded recognition, support, and the chance to rebuild their own story beyond the initial pain and confusion. It was a heartbreaking but necessary lesson, because understanding that the heart did not match was not just forensic data or medical error, but accepting that human lives are sometimes more fragile and mysterious than we can assume. Amid this turmoil, an unexpected figure appeared, an investigative journalist whom I had contacted with doubts about how to continue exposing the case without risking those involved, surprised me by providing documents he had managed to obtain on his own. His independent work confirmed many of the facts I already had, and, most importantly, added testimonies from other regions with parallel cases. It was a crucial connection that gave a national dimension to what had started as a local enigma. Now the issue could no longer be ignored. It was impossible to look the other way. With that combined strength, we managed to call a public hearing. Seeing so many families gathered, so many eyes seeking answers, though silences heavy with waiting, was one of the most emotional and at the same time most difficult moments of this whole story. Emotions overflowed when the names were read, when it was understood that behind each case there was a person with dreams, fears, and a story worth telling. But the fragility of justice in a system that often prefers indifference also became evident. That hearing shook the foundations. Some officials could not hide their discomfort, and palpable tensions arose. However, amid the friction, a solid truth emerged. The urgent need to repair and build a path that recognized those who had been made invisible and forgotten. For the first time, there was clear talk about stricter protocols, psychological support, and mechanisms to prevent something like this from happening again. It was just a beginning, but a necessary step amid a long road still ahead. While the echo of that day still resonated, I understood something fundamental. This story was not just a medical case or a resolve file. It was a deep call to rethink how we understand ourselves as a society. It revealed the invisible cracks in the institutional fabric, the shadows where forgotten wounds dwell, and above all, it reminded us that empathy and justice must always go hand in hand, because only then can we offer a future where heartbeats, whatever their name or origin, finally find their place. I continued down this path, certain that many voices remained to be heard, many hearts to understand. I cannot predict the end of the story, nor do I know where it will lead me. But I do know that every step taken resonates with those who were silenced, that every truth revealed is a victory against indifference, and that the beat of a heart that didn't match has become the beat of an urgent justice. And so, I confess to you, my friend, this story still beats here inside me, and also inside all those who still seek their truth. Because in the end, it doesn't matter how different our rhythms are or the origin of our heartbeats. What matters is that we learn to listen to each other, to recognize ourselves in our shadows and lights. Only then will we build a collective embrace where no one has to feel like a stranger in their own blood. Sometimes, a heartbeat that doesn't match is the beginning of a bigger story, one that invites us to tear down walls and open doors to truth, reconciliation, and hope. And as long as there is breath, I will be there, listening to that heart that insists on finding its place in the world.